Hi. Let's read A Drop of Mercy, Chapter 12, picking up Heinrich back in Germantown. Aunt Esther smiled at Heinrich. Or was that a frown? I'm going to miss you, Heinrich. I've started to think you were one of my own. I will miss you too, Aunt Esther. All of you. He looked around at the family gathered on the front porch. It hardly seems like it's been 6 months. You still planning to head straight through? Uncle Samuel asked. If I can. Dottie says things have calmed down since the British left. If I make good time, I should be in Germantown by supper time. Imagine that. There's still the assembly. I won't be going into the city. And the militia. I'll be careful. Godspeed then, son. Heinrich waved goodbye and turned toward the road. He had actually been disappointed to receive the letter from his father, telling him it was safe to come home. His blood pulsed to the rhythm of the farm now. He understood why his uncle had chosen it over life in town. Thankfully, leaving got easier the farther he walked. Aunt Esther was wonderful, but she wasn't Mom. He missed his father, too, and Klaus. It would be good to see them. Dottie's letter said the British had left Philadelphia for good this time, actually boarded ships and pulled out of the harbor for ports unknown. Washington's men had moved into the vacuum, to be sure, but they hadn't stayed long. The bulk of them had crossed the Delaware and took their war with them. Good riddance. An image of Nat, lying in his arms, asking about his mother's bread, thrust itself into Heinrich's thoughts. Germantown had that about it, too. Memories and shame. Would it all come back every time he stepped into the yard? Good God, help me to move on. It was mid-June, the best season for walking. He passed Methacton by mid-morning and sat beside an elderberry bush at the edge of the woods for a brief rest. The clusters of tiny white flowers that covered the bush caught his eye. Funny he had never noticed before, but each flower had 5 small, yellow-tipped stalks reaching out of its center like spokes on a wheel. They were really quite pretty. He plucked a cluster from the bush and popped the flowers into his mouth. They tasted like sunshine and honey all rolled into one delicious package. He'd have preferred the berries, but flowers were what the bush was making in June, so flowers were what he got. He ate a few more bunches, took a sip from his cider skin, and resumed walking. He shared the road with all manner of people, single walkers like himself, families with carts and horses that had escaped the notice of the requisitioning parties, even militia strolling along in leisurely fashion like the rest, as if the war were truly over, and not just moved far enough away that they would never have to fight in it. Heinrich was too far from home to recognize anyone, though, unless... Wait! Was that Christopher Sauer ahead? No, not enough beard. The man did look like him, though, even walked the same. Heinrich lengthened his steps. Excuse me, neighbor, he said, catching up to the man. The traveler turned around. His eyes lit up immediately with recognition. Well, if it isn't young Groff. And what brings you out this far from home? Dottie wanted me to get away from the war for a while, so I spent the winter at my uncle's. But I thought you were in Philadelphia. The older man nodded. I was. What do you say to setting a spell and eating our lunch in silence? Then, when our bellies are less demanding of attention, we can walk along together and exchange stories. Heinrich tried not to stare at Christopher's beard, or what was left of it, as he ate his loaf. The man had always been meticulous about his appearance. Then again, he was a preacher. Christopher looked at Heinrich over the top of his spectacles. They chopped it off. What? My beard. You were staring. Heinrich fidgeted. Well, it's fine. I've gotten used to it. Who chopped it off? Christopher stood and smoothed his coat down over his breeches. Heinrich followed suit. They picked up their gear and resumed their journey. You heard about the new provisions to the Test Act, Christopher asked. I saw the handbill. Did you read anything in there about unlawfully seizing a peaceful citizen from his home, shamefully abusing him and making him march in ill-fitted shoes for several hours? I don't remember anything like that. That's because it isn't there. Apparently, this conversation was going to take a while. That was fine. They still had a good 10 miles ahead of them. I suppose you heard about the edict of May 8th, calling a particular 58 men, of which I am one, to report by the 23rd of June and swear allegiance to the self-proclaimed governors of the state. Of course, I couldn't do that. Of course. What is today's date? The 21st, I believe. You are correct. Thus, the date by which I was to report is yet 2 days hence, though in truth they later amended their edict and moved the date forward to June 6th. Tell me then why I should be arrested on the 25th of May, a full 2 weeks before the date assigned to me. Why? What did you do? I have committed no crime against either the Crown or the Pennsylvania Assembly, nor against any individual that I am aware of. I suspect it might be because my son Christopher III, for as you know I am the second by that name, has been labeled a loyalist by those who wish to categorize men so. Did they give you a chance to explain yourself? Very little, though I doubt whether they would have listened regardless. The shameless villains! Shameless indeed. But you mustn't hurl insults so, Heinrich. Well, it's not right. Did they make you go to jail? They took me to the provost in General Washington's camp. As you know, I had retired from Germantown to live with 3 of my children in Philadelphia shortly after the battle last October. I had heard how a number of Quakers had already been punished and carried away to Virginia, and learning that there were yet some hundreds of men on the list to be taken up and secured, amongst which my name was also put down, and hearing that some of the millers on the Wissahickon had already been taken away from their families, I hoped I might find peace among the British then in charge of that city. I lived there quietly and peaceably until May 2nd, when it seemed things had settled down enough that I might return to my home in Germantown. Heinrich interrupted. And that's when they got you? Christopher nodded. I was in my home when, at 10 o'clock at night, a party of soldiers surrounded the house and fetched me out of my bed. They led me through the Indian cornfields to Bastion Miller's barn, driving and yelling, for I could not come along as fast as they wanted me to go. Did they hurt you? They frequently struck me in the back with their bayonets. But I would have preferred a full night of that sort of treatment to the shameful abuse to which they put me when we arrived at the barn. What did they do there? Or would you rather not say? Better to say it and let it go than brood upon it in silence. They held me at the barn until morning. Then they stripped me naked to the skin and gave me an old shirt and breeches, so torn that I could hardly cover my private parts. They cut my beard and hair and painted me with oil colors, red and black, till I would have been ashamed to be seen of anyone who knew me. The preacher fell silent. Heinrich allowed him his quiet sorrow. After a while, Christopher resumed his tale. It was a very hot day, and my feet began to ache from walking barefooted. A friend of mine, seeing me in that condition, asked the soldiers whether they would take the shoes away from me if he were to give me a pair. They promised to allow me to keep any shoes I was given. And so my friend took the shoes from his own feet and the hat from his own head and gave them to me. May the good Lord return the blessing 100-fold upon him for that kind deed. We marched on for about 6 miles when a soldier, not related to the band that had arrested me, demanded my borrowed shoes. They let him take them. In exchange, they put upon my feet the old slabs he had been wearing. These wounded my feet very much. Heinrich's fists clenched. "'Tis shameful! Shameful!" So it was. But thoughts of the shame of our Lord endured bolstered my faith, so I opened not my mouth. About 9 o'clock, we arrived at the army's camp, and I was sent to the provost and formally accused of being both an oppressor of the righteous and a spy, though upon what grounds they based these charges I was never told. That's ridiculous. So I thought. In all my years as a preacher of the gospel, I have done nothing but promote righteousness. It is a ridiculous charge indeed. Be that as it is, God moved the heart of the most generous General Muhlenberg to inquire into my affairs. He spoke to General Washington on my behalf, to the effect that, through the good hand of Providence, I was released with a pass from the provost on the 29th of May, with the understanding that I was not to return to Germantown until such time as the British had been whole removed from Pennsylvania. Christopher pulled a piece of paper from his pack and showed it to Heinrich. I have been in Methacton since that time, abiding by the prohibition against returning to my home. But, As the British seem to have left the state in the hands of the continental governors, I am now returning as my pass allows." Heinrich shook his head. "I hardly know what to say. I only wish I were as forgiving as you." "Love as our master loves, dear boy, and that will be forgiving enough." See you next week.